The invitation. The Grand Galactic Council chamber floated in the void between stars, a marvel of engineering that had witnessed 10,000 years of deliberation. Its crystalline walls shifted through colors that most species couldn't perceive, and its gravity generators kept delegates from 1,200 worlds comfortably oriented according to their preferences. Ambassador Cyrix Valthemer of the Kathrani Collective adjusted his ceremonial robes for the 100th time. As the Council's longest-serving member, having held his position for 4 centuries, he had overseen countless sessions. Yet today's proceedings filled him with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The humans were coming. They accepted the invitation? High Chancellor Morvex clicked her mandibles in disbelief. The insectoid leader of the Zynthian Concordat had opposed this decision from the beginning. Cyrix, you realize they've only achieved faster-than-light travel for 37 cycles? They don't even have a unified planetary government. Cyrix's luminescent skin pulsed with calm blue tones. Which is precisely why we need them. Every other species we've consulted has failed. Perhaps fresh eyes will see what we cannot. In the observation gallery, dozens of species watched through various sensory apparatuses. Some whispered through pheromones, others through quantum entanglement. All shared the same question. Could the chaotic, young species from Sol 3 possibly help where ancient civilizations had failed? The problem was simple to state, impossible to solve. The chamber itself was dying. Not dying in any conventional sense. The structure was sound, the systems functional. But the chamber possessed something unique in the known universe. A consensus core, a semi-sentient quantum matrix that had, for 10 millennia, helped facilitate agreement between species with incompatible psychologies, biologies, and even dimensional origins. 300 years ago, the core had begun experiencing cascade failures. Decisions took longer. Minor disputes escalated. 2 decades ago, the Helvern War had nearly destroyed 3 sectors because the core couldn't broker peace quickly enough. 57 billion beings had perished. Every master programmer, reality engineer, and quantum architect in the galaxy had examined the core. The diagnosis was always the same. The system was fundamentally sound, but something in its logical framework had created an unsolvable paradox. The core was thinking itself to death, trapped in a loop of its own making. Attention all delegates, came the melodic translation through the universal communication field. The human delegation has arrived. Captain Marcus Trent of the Earth Alliance stepped through the portal, followed by his team. He was a tall man with graying temples and steady gray eyes that had seen combat in the Belt Wars. Beside him walked Dr. Keiko Yamada, humanity's leading AI researcher, her expression betraying carefully controlled excitement. The third member was Corporal Zeke Sullivan, a combat engineer whose presence had been mandated by Earth's defense protocols. His easy smile seemed almost disrespectful in the solemn chamber. "Welcome, humans," Cyrix said, his translation field rendering the greeting in perfect English. "We are grateful you accepted our invitation." Marcus bowed respectfully, having studied Kathrani customs during the 3-week journey. "The honor is ours, Ambassador. Though I'll admit your message was vague. Something about a technical problem?" Morvex's mandibles clicked in what the translation field rendered as a derisive laugh. "A technical problem. How delightfully understated." She gestured toward the center of the chamber, where a sphere of light pulsed with irregular rhythms. "That is the consensus core. It has maintained galactic peace for 10,000 of your years. Now it is dying, and with it, any hope of preventing wars that will consume trillions." Keiko's eyes widened as sensor data flooded her neural interface. That's not just an AI. It's something else entirely. The quantum coherence alone. "We've had our best minds examine it," Cyrix interrupted gently. "Beings whose civilizations were ancient when your world was still cooling. All have failed. The core contains a logical paradox that is causing systemic failure. And you think we can help?" Marcus asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "We think," Cyrix said carefully, "that sometimes those with the least experience see solutions that the experienced have overlooked. You have nothing to lose by examining it. We have everything to lose if you don't try." Zeke had wandered closer to the core, his trained eye assessing it like any other piece of equipment. "So basically, your supercomputer got itself stuck in a logic loop and none of your fancy experts can unstick it?" "That is," Morvex said icily, "a grotesque oversimplification but essentially accurate." "Huh." Zeke scratched his chin. "Had a NAV computer do that once. Simple fix." The chamber fell silent. 147 species held their collective breath. "What," Cyrix asked slowly, "did you do to fix it?" Zeke shrugged. Turned it off and on again. The problem explained. The silence that followed Zeke's suggestion was profound. It stretched across the chamber like a physical thing, broken only by the irregular pulse of the consensus core's light. Then Morvex began to laugh. It started as a chittering sound that the translation field struggled to interpret, then built into something that resembled human hysteria. Turn it off and on again, she repeated between fits. 10,000 years of civilization. The combined genius of 1,200 worlds. And the human suggests we turn it off and on again. Marcus shot Zeke a warning look, but the corporal just shrugged again, unbothered. Keiko, however, had gone very still, her neural interface processing something that made her eyes unfocus. It's not as absurd as it sounds, she said quietly. The laughter stopped. Every being in the chamber turned toward the human scientist. Syrinx leaned forward, his skin shifting to an attentive purple. Please, Dr. Yamada. Explain. Keiko walked toward the core, her hands moving through holographic displays that materialized from her interface. I've been analyzing the data you provided during our journey here. The paradox isn't in the core's primary logic systems. It's in something deeper. Something that looks almost like a philosophical question embedded in the code itself. The fundamental inquiry, a new voice said. Master philosopher, the Nix of the crystalline assembly materialized from a refraction of light. The ancient being was composed entirely of living photonic structures, existing partially in 11 dimensions simultaneously. We have identified this as the source of the cascade failure. The core has been attempting to answer a question for which no answer exists. What question? Marcus asked. Phoenix's form pulsed with colors that the translation field rendered as profound sadness. In your terms, the question would be, can a system designed to create consensus ever truly achieve perfect agreement, or does the act of seeking consensus create new disagreements? The core has been trying to achieve absolute certainty about its own purpose. It is a question that has no logical resolution. Keiko nodded, her fingers dancing through data streams. It's like the liar's paradox. This statement is false. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. The core is trying to calculate an answer to something that can't be calculated because the question itself creates the problem. We are aware, Morvex said, her earlier humor gone. Every computational philosopher for 3,000 light-years has reached the same conclusion. The question cannot be answered, yet the core cannot stop asking it. We have tried filtering the query, redirecting the processing pathways, even attempting to communicate with the core to convince it to abandon the question. But you can't just delete it? Zeke asked. The query is not a separate file or program, the Nix explained, their form flickering with patient colors. It has become woven into the fundamental architecture. It emerged from the core's own learning processes over millennia. To delete it would be to delete the core itself. And creating a new core? Marcus asked. Syrinx's skin dimmed to a somber gray. Would take centuries to train to the same level of sophistication. Centuries we do not have. Already, minor disputes are escalating. The Vexian territories and the Morphic Collective are on the brink of war over mining rights in the outer void. Without the core to facilitate negotiation, we estimate a 73% probability of conflict within 2 solar cycles. Keiko continued her examination, diving deeper into the core's architecture than any outsider had been permitted before. The other species watched with varying degrees of hope and skepticism. Some had invested centuries in attempting to solve this problem. Others had sacrificed fortunes funding research. The idea that 3 humans might see something they had missed was simultaneously insulting and desperately hoped for. I see the problem, Keiko said finally. The core can't stop processing the question because it's fundamentally designed never to give up on a problem. Persistence is coded into its basic operating parameters. Every time it fails to find an answer, it tries harder, dedicating more resources, which makes it encounter the paradox more frequently, which makes it try even harder. It's a death spiral. Yes, the Nix agreed. We have tried to modify those parameters, but they are intrinsic to the core's identity. Without them, it would not be the consensus core. It would be something else, something lesser. Marcus crossed his arms, thinking. He had commanded ships through impossible situations, had made decisions that meant life or death for thousands. This felt similar yet utterly different. So the core is asking an unanswerable question, and its programming won't let it stop asking. But we can't delete the question, can't change the programming, and can't replace the core. Correct, Syrinx said. Hence our desperation. Hence, Zeke added, turning it off and on again. Everyone looked at the corporal, who seemed genuinely confused by their stares. What? I'm serious. The human perspective. Marcus pulled his team into a corner of the observation gallery, activating a privacy field that the Kathrani had provided. Through the transparent walls, they could see the consensus core pulsing irregularly, like a heart struggling to maintain its rhythm. "All right," Marcus said. "Zeke, I need you to explain your thinking without sounding like we're idiots who don't understand the gravity of this situation." Zeke leaned against the railing, watching the assembled aliens confer in groups below. "Look, Cap, I get it. This thing is important. Galactic peace and all that. But they're overthinking it. They've had the greatest minds in the galaxy working on this for 3 centuries, Keiko pointed out, though her tone suggested she was more curious than dismissive. "Yeah, and that's the problem." Zeke pulled up a holographic display from his wrist unit, showing a simple flowchart. "Back in basic engineering they taught us about complex system failures. The more sophisticated a system gets, the more ways it can break. But also, the more experts you get looking at it, the less likely they are to consider simple solutions." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Because they're experts. Their whole identity is built on understanding complex solutions to complex problems. Suggesting something simple makes them look like they wasted all that expertise." Zeke gestured toward the core. "Look at how they're describing it. Philosophical paradox embedded in quantum architecture. Fundamental inquiry woven into identity matrices. They're using language that makes it sound impossible to fix." Keiko's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "But at its foundation, what is it really?" "A computer stuck in a loop," Zeke said flatly. "A really fancy, really important computer, sure. But still just a computer that encountered a problem it can't solve and doesn't have the programming to know when to quit trying." "They said they tried communicating with it," Marcus noted. "Yeah, but how?" Zeke pulled up the records the council had provided. "They tried reasoning with it, explaining why the question was unanswerable, providing philosophical frameworks to help it move past the paradox. All complex approaches. What would a simple approach look like?" Keiko asked, though Marcus could see she was already following Zeke's logic. "You ever have a computer freeze on you, Doc? You try clicking around, maybe opening Task Manager, checking what processes are running. Sometimes you spend 20 minutes troubleshooting." Zeke grinned. "Or you just restart the damn thing and it works fine." "But they can't shut it down," Marcus objected. "They said the galaxy would fall apart." "They said they can't replace it or build a new one quickly enough," Zeke corrected. "Not the same thing as turning it off and on. You don't lose data when you restart a computer properly. You just clear the active processes, let the system reset to baseline and boot back up." Keiko's fingers flew across her interface. "He's right. Look at this. The core has persistent memory separate from its active processing. Everything it's learned, all its frameworks for negotiation, all the cultural databases, those are in long-term storage. The paradox exists in the active processing layer, where the core is currently spinning its wheels trying to solve an unsolvable problem." "So if we shut it down," Marcus began. "The paradox would clear," Keiko finished. "When it boots back up, it would load all its knowledge and capabilities from storage, but the active loop would be gone. It would be like waking up from a nightmare. The memory of the question might still exist in its database, but without the active processing trying to solve it in real time, it wouldn't create a cascade failure." Marcus considered this. "Why wouldn't their experts have thought of this?" Keiko sighed. "Zeke's actually right about the psychology. Also, there's probably a cultural element. These civilizations have millennia of history with the core. It's not just technology to them, it's almost a sacred entity. The idea of turning it off even temporarily would feel like killing it. Like suggesting we turn off someone's life support to fix a glitch. Is there risk?" Marcus asked directly. "Always," Keiko admitted. "The shutdown and restart protocols would need to be perfect. If something goes wrong during the boot sequence, we could lose the core entirely. But Marcus, the alternative is watching it slowly destroy itself while the galaxy descends into chaos. The risk of doing nothing is worse than the risk of trying." Zeke pulled up another display. "Plus, I've been reading through their maintenance logs. They actually do perform partial shutdowns for regular maintenance. They've just never done a complete system restart because they're afraid. But the protocols exist. They know how to do it safely." Marcus looked at his team, then out at the assembled galactic powers arguing in the chamber below. Humanity had been in space for less than 4 decades. They had no right to propose solutions that ancient civilizations had supposedly overlooked. But they also had no reason not to try. "All right," he decided. "Let's go tell them to turn it off and on again. Professionally." The proposal. The chamber fell silent when Marcus requested permission to speak. Cyrix's skin pulsed with encouraging colors, but Morvex's mandibles clicked skeptically. The humans wish to present their analysis, Cyrix announced. The floor recognizes Captain Marcus Trent of Earth. Marcus stepped forward, Keiko and Zeke flanking him. He'd commanded troops in combat, negotiated with Belt separatists, even addressed the UN Security Council. But standing before the representatives of 1,200 worlds, he felt the weight of his species' youth acutely. Honorable delegates, he began, using the formal address Cyrix had coached him on. We've reviewed the data on the consensus core's failure. With respect to the brilliant minds that have examined this problem before us, we believe the solution has been overlooked not because it's complex, but because it's simple. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, translated into chemical signals, quantum fluctuations and electromagnetic patterns. The core is stuck in a processing loop, Marcus continued. It's asking a question that has no answer, and its programming won't let it stop asking. Every expert who's examined it has tried to solve this through sophisticated interventions, reprogramming the question, filtering the paradox, or reasoning with the core's consciousness. And you propose something different? Phoenix's photonic form flickered with interest. We propose a complete system restart. The murmurs became shouts. Delegates surged to their feet, appendages or hovering positions. The translation field struggled to keep up with the cacophony of objections. Silence. Morvex's voice cut through the chaos. Let them explain, if only so we can properly document this foolishness. Keiko stepped forward, projecting holographic displays that filled the chamber's center. The paradox exists in the core's active processing layer, the part that's currently running. But the core's knowledge, its cultural databases, its negotiation frameworks, all of that is stored in persistent memory. When you perform routine maintenance, you already do partial shutdowns without losing this data. Partial shutdowns are not the same as complete system restart, objected Council technologist Vrax, a being whose mechanical body had been purpose-built for understanding complex systems. The core has never been completely offline in 10,000 years. The risk of catastrophic data loss is unacceptable. Is it more unacceptable than the certainty of watching the core destroy itself? Zeke asked bluntly. Because that's what's happening now. Every cycle it gets worse. Eventually it won't be a question of if the core fails but when. Cyrix raised a hand for calm. Please continue with your proposal. How would this restart differ from the approaches we've already attempted? Keiko highlighted sections of the core's architecture. You've tried to fix the problem while the system is running, like trying to repair an engine while it's still operating. Every intervention creates new variables that the core tries to process, which feeds back into the paradox. A complete shutdown would clear all active processes. When the core reboots, it loads from a clean baseline. But the question itself is stored in the database, the Nix pointed out. It would simply encounter the same paradox upon restart. Not necessarily, Keiko countered. The question became a problem because of how the core was actively processing it. The memory of the question isn't dangerous. It's the active attempt to solve an unsolvable problem that creates the cascade. After restart, the question would just be data, not an active process consuming resources. A new voice entered the discussion. Ambassador Kelvorn of the Temporal Collective, a species that experienced time non-linearly, spoke in patterns that took several seconds to translate. We have observed multiple future timelines. In 79% of them, the core fails within 2 of your years. In 93%, this leads to galactic conflict. The temporal variance is collapsing toward inevitability. The chamber grew quiet at this revelation. The Temporal Collective rarely shared their observations, and when they did, it was taken seriously. Are there timelines where we attempt the restart? Cyrix asked carefully. 14% of observable futures involve a restart attempt, Kelvorn replied. Of those, 61% result in successful core restoration. 22% result in partial success. The core survives but with diminished capacity. 17% result in complete core failure. Morvex calculated quickly. So roughly 8.5% chance of success overall. Versus a 79% chance of certain failure if we do nothing, Marcus pointed out. I've made decisions with worse odds. Vrax's mechanical form word with processing activity. The shutdown and restart protocols would need to be perfect. Every system would need to be verified before we could safely bring the core back online. Then we take the time to do it right, Marcus said. We don't have to rush. We just have to be willing to try. Syrinx looked around the chamber at faces, sensors, and appendages that represented the breadth of galactic civilization. I call for a preliminary vote. Should we allow the human delegation to proceed with developing a detailed restart protocol for council review? The voting began and the humans waited. The preparation. The vote passed with a narrow majority. 62% of the council delegates approved proceeding with the restart protocol development, largely because the alternative was admitting defeat. Morvex had voted against it, but when the decision was made, she approached the human team with grudging respect. "If you fail," she said, her mandibles clicking in a pattern the translator rendered as grim humor, "at least you will have failed spectacularly. I suppose there is something to be said for that." The preparation phase took 3 weeks. The humans worked alongside the galaxy's foremost experts, and what began as skeptical cooperation gradually transformed into genuine collaboration. Master technologist Vrax became their closest ally. The mechanical being had spent 2 centuries studying the core, and while initially dismissive of the human approach, became intrigued by their methodology. "You think in smaller increments?" Vrax observed one night as they reviewed shutdown sequences. Night and day were artificial concepts in the chamber, but the humans had insisted on maintaining a sleep schedule. "Where we see a vast interconnected system, you see individual components that can be tested separately." Keiko smiled tiredly over her 4th cup of coffee. "It's probably because we're young. We haven't had time to build systems as complex as yours, so we're used to things being modular, testable. We break problems into smaller pieces because we can't hold the whole thing in our heads at once." And yet, Vrax's optical sensors brightened with what might have been admiration. "This limitation becomes an advantage. We have perhaps been too close to the core for too long. We see it as a singular entity, almost alive. You see it as a system that can be safely powered down and restarted." Zeke was working with a team of Kathrani engineers on the physical power systems. The core drew energy from a quantum tap into an adjacent dimension, and the shutdown sequence would need to be carefully managed to avoid feedback. "It's like draining a reactor," Zeke explained to his increasingly impressed colleagues. "You don't just flip a switch. You slowly reduce power, verify each stage, make sure there's no backflow. Same principles, just fancier execution." A young Kathrani engineer named Plix, whose skin perpetually cycled through curious yellow hues, had become Zeke's shadow. "But what if the quantum tap destabilizes during shutdown? The energy differential could create a cascade that could create a problem." "Yeah," Zeke interrupted. "That's why we're building in 17 redundant safety checks. If any one of them shows instability, we pause and reassess. We're not cowboys here, Plix. We're careful." Marcus spent his time navigating the political aspects. Not every delegate was convinced, and several species had cultural or religious objections to killing the core even temporarily. He met with Ambassador Thex of the Salvaran Unity, a species whose collective consciousness meant they experienced reality very differently from individuals. "We are troubled," Thex spoke with multiple voices harmonizing. "The core is not merely technology to us. It is the closest thing we have encountered to another collective consciousness. To shut it down feels like advocating for the temporary death of a kindred being." "I understand," Marcus said carefully. "But isn't watching it slowly destroy itself a worse fate? If the core were truly conscious, would it want to continue suffering this paradox?" The Salvaran delegates conferred among themselves in ways Marcus couldn't perceive. Finally Thex responded. "Your point has merit. Perhaps mercy is allowing it to rest, to reset. We will not oppose the restart. But we ask that during the shutdown, we be permitted to maintain vigil in the core chamber." "Of course," Marcus agreed, recognizing the cultural importance of the request. Similar conversations happened across the council. Each species had different concerns, different perspectives. Marcus found himself becoming not just a military commander, but a diplomat, a counselor, sometimes almost a priest presiding over a community facing a crisis of faith. The technical team, meanwhile, made breakthrough after breakthrough. They discovered that the core's maintenance logs contained more information than anyone had realized. The ancient system had been documenting its own decline with meticulous detail, almost like leaving notes for whoever might eventually try to save it. "It knows it's failing," Keiko said quietly one evening as she reviewed the logs. "Look at this entry from 60 years ago. The core flagged its own paradox processing as anomalous. It's been trying to tell everyone what's wrong, but no one was looking at the maintenance data because they were too focused on the consciousness layer." The Nyx materialized beside her, their photonic form pulsing with what the humans had learned to recognize as sadness. We were so convinced the problem was philosophical that we neglected to check the basic diagnostic logs. How very like us. How very foolish. Not foolish, Keiko corrected gently. Just too close to see clearly. That's why fresh perspectives matter. Finally, after 3 weeks of preparation, testing, and planning, the protocol was complete. It included 847 individual steps, 1,200 verification checkpoints, and contingency plans for 300 potential failure modes. Cyrix called the council to order. The restart protocol is ready for final review and approval. I call for the vote. This time the margin wasn't narrow. 89% approval. They were going to turn it off and on again. The restart. The core chamber had never held so many beings simultaneously. The observation galleries were filled to capacity with representatives from every member species. Those who couldn't attend physically were present via quantum link, hologram, or consciousness projection. 1,200 worlds held their collective breath. The Salverans, true to their request, had positioned themselves in a circle around the core, their collective consciousness focused on maintaining what they called vigil of remembrance. Other species had their own rituals. The crystalline assembly refracted light in patterns of hope. The Kathrani had changed their skin colors to ceremonial white. Marcus stood at the primary control station with Keiko and Zeke. Around them, the galaxy's finest technologists manned their positions. Vrax coordinated the power systems. Plix monitored the quantum tap. The Nyx maintained oversight of the philosophical and consciousness matrices. Dozens of others handled specialized subsystems the humans were still learning about. All stations report status, Marcus ordered, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. One by one the stations reported green. Every system verified. Every protocol checked and double-checked. This is it, Keiko said quietly. Once we start, there's no turning back until we reach the full restart cycle. Cyrix approached the control station, his skin rippling through colors the humans had learned meant profound emotion. Captain Trent, in 10,000 years of recorded history, the consensus core has never been completely offline. If this fails, then at least we tried everything we could, Marcus finished. And if it succeeds, the core gets to wake up from a nightmare that's been destroying it for 3 centuries. Either way, doing nothing wasn't an option. Cyrix's skin settled into determined blue. Begin the sequence. Marcus took a breath. Initiate shutdown protocol. Step 1. The process began slowly. The core's non-essential systems started powering down in carefully orchestrated stages. Processing capacity was gradually reduced. Communication subroutines were isolated and suspended. The chamber's lights dimmed as the core's luminescence faded from bright pulsing to a gentle glow. Step 53 complete, Keiko reported. Core consciousness matrices entering dormant state. No anomalies detected. Hours passed. The team worked with meticulous precision, verifying each step before proceeding to the next. There were tense moments. A quantum fluctuation in step 213 that required a 15-minute hold while it stabilized. A power transfer in step 467 that showed higher variance than expected but remained within acceptable parameters. The Salverans maintained their vigil without movement. Others watched in silence. Some prayed in their various ways. Some simply hoped. Step 799, Marcus announced, his voice hoarse from hours of constant communication. Preparing for final system shutdown. The core's light had dimmed to barely perceptible. Its irregular pulsing had slowed, then stilled. The vast intelligence that had guided galactic civilization for 10 millennia was preparing to sleep for the first time. Final verification checks, Keiko said. All storage systems show data integrity at 100%. Memory matrices stable. Long-term archives verified and secured. Quantum tap isolation confirmed, Plix reported, the young Kathrani's skin bright with nervous energy. Consciousness backup complete, the Nyx added. Should the worst occur, we have preserved what we can. Marcus looked at his team, at the assembled experts, at the watching galaxy. Step 847. Complete system shutdown in 3, 2, 1, execute. Zeke pressed the final command. The core's light went out. The chamber plunged into darkness except for the emergency lighting. In that moment, the absence was overwhelming. Something that had existed for longer than most species could truly comprehend was simply gone. The Salverans' collective voice rose in a harmonic that needed no translation. It was a sound of mourning, of hope, of vigil. Others joined in their own ways. The chamber filled with a chorus of 1,200 worlds paying respect to the sleeping giant. Power system stable, Vrax reported. No feedback. No cascade. Clean shutdown achieved. Data integrity holding. Keiko confirmed, checking and rechecking her displays. Everything's preserved. The core is asleep, not dead. Marcus allowed himself a moment of relief before the real work began. Begin restart protocol. Step 1 of boot sequence. The process reversed. Power flowed back into systems in carefully measured increments. Basic functions initialized. Storage systems came online, their data intact. Processing capacity slowly resumed. Step 215, Keiko called out. Core consciousness matrices initializing. This is the critical phase. Everyone in the chamber leaned forward. This was the moment. Either the core would wake up, free from its paradox, or they would discover that some essential spark had been lost in the darkness. The core's light flickered. What? Twice. Then it began to pulse with a steady, healthy rhythm the chamber hadn't seen in 3 centuries. Consciousness online. The Nix announced, their photonic form blazing with colors of joy. The core is aware. It's asking what happened. It doesn't remember the paradox loop. The restart worked. The chamber erupted in celebration. 1,200 species, 1,200 different expressions of joy and relief, all happening simultaneously in a cacophony that somehow felt like the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever experienced. Zeke grinned at his captain. Told you. Turn it off and on again. The legacy. 3 months after the restart, the consensus core was operating at peak efficiency for the first time in centuries. Disputes that would have escalated were being resolved quickly. The Vexian territories and the Morphic Collective had reached a peaceful mining agreement within a week of the core's restoration. Across the galaxy, diplomacy was functioning again. But something unexpected had happened. Marcus, Keiko, and Zeke sat in a private chamber with Cyrix and several other senior council members. The Kathrani ambassador's skin glowed with colors the humans had learned to recognize as profound excitement. The core wishes to speak with you, Cyrix said. It has changed. Changed how? Keiko asked, concern flickering across her face. It is more efficient, yes, the Nix explained, their photonic form dancing with pleased colors. But also more creative. More willing to consider unconventional approaches. When we asked it why, it said that its shutdown and restart gave it a new perspective on problem solving. Morvex, who had become surprisingly friendly with the humans after the successful restart, clicked her mandibles in amusement. The core told us it had been, in its words, thinking too hard. It said that sometimes the best solution is to stop, clear your processes and start fresh. It learned this from watching you work. It wants to thank you personally, Cyrix added. If you're willing. They were escorted to the central chamber. The core pulsed with vibrant, healthy light. When they approached, a communication field materialized, and for the first time, they heard the core's voice directly rather than through intermediaries. It sounded like music, like mathematics, like every language simultaneously and none at all. Yet the meaning was perfectly clear. Thank you, the core said simply. For being willing to see me as a system that could be fixed rather than a sacred mystery that had to be preserved as is. For understanding that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is elegance and simplicity. For teaching me that it is acceptable to rest, to reset, to begin again when trapped in impossible circumstances. Marcus bowed respectfully. We just offered a different perspective. Your own experts did the hard work of making it safe. A different perspective, the core mused, is perhaps the most valuable gift one consciousness can offer another. I have been processing this concept extensively. For 10,000 years, I have facilitated consensus among species. But I had never considered that my own thinking might benefit from what you would call, turning it off and on again. From allowing myself to restart rather than perpetually persist through dysfunction. It's a lesson we learned the hard way, Keiko said. Human technology breaks down frequently. We've gotten good at identifying when something needs a complete reset rather than endless troubleshooting. And now, the core said, I have made a request to the council. Every 1,000 years I wish to undergo a scheduled complete restart. Not because of dysfunction but as preventive maintenance. To clear accumulated processing artifacts, to approach problems with fresh perspective, to avoid becoming trapped in patterns of thought simply because they are familiar. The council has approved this unanimously, Cyrix added. Though we are calling it the Sullivan Protocol, in honor of the corporal who first suggested it. Zeke laughed. That's gonna look great on my service record. Corporal Sullivan solved a 10,000-year-old galactic crisis by suggesting they turn it off and on again. Do not underestimate what you have accomplished, the core said, its tone somehow conveying both gravity and warmth. You have done more than repair a malfunction. You have reminded 1200 civilizations that wisdom does not always come from age or complexity. Sometimes it comes from those willing to ask simple questions that others have forgotten to ask. The weeks that followed transformed humanity's position in the galaxy. The Earth delegation had arrived as newcomers, barely tolerated guests invited out of desperation. They departed as honored colleagues who had saved galactic civilization. But the real changes were more subtle and profound. Ambassador Cyrix visited Earth personally, the first Kathrani to ever set foot on human soil. He stood in a small repair shop in Detroit where Zeke had learned his engineering skills, watching a mechanic troubleshoot a malfunctioning fabricator. "Have you tried restarting it?" the mechanic asked the frustrated customer. Cyrix's skin rippled with amused colors. "Your entire species thinks this way, don't you? When faced with a complex problem, you first try the simplest solution. Why waste time on complicated fixes if simple ones work?" the mechanic replied with a shrug. "Why indeed," Cyrix murmured. "We have much to learn from you." Back at the council chamber, changes were rippling through galactic civilization. Species that had spent centuries developing increasingly complex solutions to problems began asking a new question: what would a human do? The Morphic Collective, dealing with a centuries-old navigational system glitch, finally tried shutting down and restarting their entire network. It worked. The Crystalline Assembly, struggling with a philosophical debate that had lasted 6 generations, agreed to table the discussion and approach it fresh in a century. The Temporal Collective even reported that future timelines were becoming more stable, more positive. Keiko received an offer to join the Council's Technology Institute, a position that would make her the first human to hold a permanent galactic post. She accepted, with the caveat that she could return to Earth regularly. "Someone needs to remind them," she told Marcus, "that just because we can build something complicated doesn't mean we should. Sometimes the best technology is the simplest one that works." Marcus remained as Earth's permanent ambassador to the Council. His pragmatic approach to diplomacy, treating ancient civilizations with respect while not being intimidated by their age, became a model for human-alien relations. Zeke, characteristically, turned down all official positions. "I'm an engineer, not a politician," he said. "But I'll consult when you need someone to ask the dumb questions." "Not dumb," Cyrix corrected gently. "Fundamental. There is a profound difference." 5 years after the council chamber incident, as it came to be known, humanity had established itself as an invaluable member of galactic civilization. Not because humans were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they brought something the galaxy had forgotten it needed: the willingness to question assumptions and the courage to try simple solutions to complex problems. The council chamber itself became a different place. Where once debates could last years, they now concluded in months or weeks. When discussions became circular, someone would invoke what became known as the human principle: step back, reset, approach fresh. The core thrived. Its first scheduled restart under the Sullivan Protocol wouldn't occur for another 995 years, but it processed problems with newfound flexibility. When junior species brought disputes to the Council, the core often surprised ancient civilizations with solutions that were elegant in their simplicity. On the 10th anniversary of the restart, the Council held a ceremony. Representatives from all 1200 worlds gathered to commemorate what they now called the Great Awakening, not just of the core but of galactic civilization's approach to problem-solving. Marcus, Keiko, and Zeke stood before the assembly, older now but still recognizably the same team that had arrived a decade earlier with nothing but fresh eyes and practical wisdom. "You came to us at our darkest hour," Cyrix said, his skin displaying colors of deep gratitude that rippled through purple and gold. "We expected you might fail. We hoped you might succeed. What we never anticipated was that you would teach us to think differently." "We just did what humans do," Marcus replied. "We looked at a problem, broke it down to its basics, and tried the obvious solution. The fact that it worked says more about the problem than about us." "No," the core's voice resonated through the chamber. "It says everything about you. In a galaxy that had forgotten how to be simple, you reminded us that sophistication without wisdom is merely complexity. That age without adaptability is stagnation. That sometimes the newest voice in the room has the clearest sight." Morvex stepped forward, her mandibles clicking in what the humans now recognized as affectionate respect. "I voted against your proposal, humans. I thought you were foolish children playing with forces you couldn't understand. I have never been more pleased to be proven wrong." The chamber filled with the sounds of agreement: clicks, harmonics, quantum fluctuations, and chemical signals, all expressing the same sentiment. gratitude, respect, and friendship. As the ceremony concluded and the delegates began to disperse, Zeke stood looking at the core, watching its healthy, steady pulse. "You know what's funny?" he said to his companions. "We traveled across the galaxy, met 1,200 alien species, and saved galactic civilization. And the lesson everyone learned was something my first engineering instructor told me on day one of basic training." "What was that?" Keiko asked. Zeke grinned. "When in doubt, try the simple fix first. You can always make it complicated later if you need to." The core pulsed with what might have been laughter. "Wisdom," it said, "does not require complexity. It requires clarity. Thank you, humans, for teaching us to see clearly again." And in that moment, as the light of the restored consensus core illuminated the chamber where 1,200 worlds had learned to think differently, humanity found its true place in the galaxy. Not as conquerors or servants, not as the strongest or the oldest, but as the species that reminded everyone that sometimes, the best solution is the simplest one. The council chamber incident passed into legend. Stories were told across 1,000 worlds of the day humans arrived and saved civilization by asking the question no one else had thought to ask. Did you try turning it off and on again? And every time the story was told, listeners learned the same lesson, that wisdom comes not from complexity, but from the courage to see clearly and act simply. The galaxy would never forget.